A heavy marble desk overlooks the Mediterranean Sea. The salt wind blows through the coastal palace at Caesarea. He was sent to Judea, specifically to restore order. And he took his job very seriously. He operated by a rigid manual of imperial law. The rustling of robes and lowered voices replaced the shouting of the accusers. The council must verify only one detail. Is the appeal legally valid? Has the prisoner been caught in the act of a heinous crime, such as murder or piracy, which would forfeit the right? The records are checked. The citizenship is confirmed. The law is clear. Festus turns back to face the apostle. The book of Acts captures the governor's official, binding decree in a single, dramatic sentence: "To Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you shall go." In that moment, Festus likely feels a wave of immense relief. The political crisis has been averted. He does not have to anger the Jewish elite by releasing Paul, nor does he have to violate Roman law by condemning an innocent citizen to please them. The bureaucratic machinery has functioned perfectly. The problem has been successfully exported across the Mediterranean. But as the courtroom empties, and the guards lead Paul back to his cell, a terrifying legal reality begins to dawn on the efficient governor. Under Roman administrative law, a governor could not simply put a citizen in chains, place him on a grain ship, and send him to the capital. The prisoner had to be accompanied by a formal document called the Lettere Dimissoriae, the official report outlining the specific charges, the evidence gathered, trusting that the bema, the raised Roman judgment seat, was the ultimate and flawless mechanism for resolving human conflict, and the legal rationale for the trial. Festus has absolutely nothing to write. If he sends Paul to Rome with a blank ledger, it will look like gross administrative incompetence. Worse, the emperor currently sitting on the throne in Rome is Nero, sending the volatile, unpredictable emperor a prisoner with a letter explaining that the dispute centers entirely around a dead carpenter named Jesus, whom the prisoner claims is alive, would be professional suicide. To the imperial court, it would read like a ridiculous joke. The precise, by-the-book administrator is suddenly trapped by his own system. He has legally committed himself to sending Paul to the highest tribunal in the world, but it is illegal and absurd to send a prisoner without clear, documented charges. Festus stares at the blank parchment on his desk. He does not understand the theology, the terminology, or the stakes of this Jewish dispute. He cannot write the report, but he cannot delay the prisoner indefinitely. Festus desperately needs an expert. He needs someone who understands both the cold machinery of Roman politics and the complex, fiery world of Jewish religion. He needs someone to translate this theological crisis into Roman legal terms. And just days later, the exact person he needs arrives at the palace, with royal fanfare. Festus needed someone who understood Jewish theology. He was about to receive a king, which brings us to the central question. Why did God entrust the final, most crucial leg of Paul's journey to Rome? Trumpets sound over the harbor of Caesarea. The massive stone gates of the coastal palace swing open to receive royalty. King Agrippa II and his sister Bernice have arrived with immense pomp and pageantry to pay their formal respects to the new Roman governor. Agrippa represents the last remnants of the Herodian dynasty. He is a king, but a client king, a ruler whose crown only exists because the Roman Empire allows it. He has no legal jurisdiction over Festus. But Agrippa possesses something the Roman governor desperately needs. Because he was raised at the complicated intersection of imperial politics and Jewish religion, Agrippa is Rome's appointed curator of the Jerusalem temple. He is an expert in the exact theological disputes that have paralyzed Festus. After the royal guests have settled, Festus takes the opportunity to lay his administrative nightmare on the table. He explains the situation to the king. He describes the prisoner left to rot by Felix, the ambush he carefully avoided in Jerusalem, and the baffling trial at the Bema seat. Festus admits his profound frustration. He tells Agrippa that, when the accusers stood up, they did not charge Paul with any of the violent, political crimes a governor would expect. To a secular administrator who completely misunderstood the Christian message, the answer fundamentally changes how we view the obstacles in our own lives. Instead, the dispute centered entirely on their own religion, and on a certain Jesus, who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. Picture the irony of this conversation. A Roman governor, representing the most terrifying military machine in history, sits with a wealthy Middle Eastern king, admitting that the legal apparatus of the province is completely stuck over the resurrection of a Jewish carpenter. Festus confesses his administrative failure. He explains that Paul has appealed to the emperor, but the official imperial paperwork remains blank. To the men in the room, this is merely a bureaucratic consultation. But step back and look at the architecture of the story decades earlier. When Paul was struck blind on the road to Damascus, God spoke a specific, defining prophecy over his life. In Acts chapter 9, God declared, "He is a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel." How does a persecuted Jewish tentmaker secure an audience with royalty? He does not bribe his way into the palace. He does not launch a political campaign. He does not even ask for the meeting. God simply uses the administrative confusion of a secular bureaucrat because Festus is an efficient administrator who refuses to break imperial protocol. He cannot send a prisoner without documented charges. This is not ultimately a story about a prisoner trapped in a corrupt legal system. It is a story about a cold, secular bureaucracy. Because he cannot figure out the charges, he is forced to seek expert counsel. The paperwork problem was not a delay. It was a divine setup. God engineered a bureaucratic roadblock specifically to place a king in the audience. Intrigued by the political and religious puzzle, Agrippa leans forward. He looks at the governor and says, "I would like to hear the man myself." Festus, desperate for the material to finally finish his official report, immediately agrees. "Tomorrow," he promises, "you will hear him." The next morning, the functional, administrative courtroom is transformed into a royal theater. The heavy bronze doors of the Caesarean auditorium swing open. The Book of Acts specifically notes that King Agrippa and Bernice enter the hall with great pomp. The Greek word used here is phantasia, meaning a grand, visual display of wealth and status. They are not alone. The high-ranking military tribunes, the commanders of the Roman cohorts stationed in the city, march in alongside the prominent men of Caesarea. Sunlight catches the polished armor of the guards, the purple robes of the Herodian royalty, and the ceremonial garments of the Roman officials. It is a stunning concentration of political, military, and social power. Then, at the command of Festus, the prisoner is brought in. The contrast is absolute. Paul enters the vast, echoing hall wearing the simple tunic of a tentmaker, the heavy iron of a Roman chain dragging against his wrist, functioning exactly as designed, only to be hijacked by God to transport a divine message. Festus's primary problem is not malice. He possesses no wealth, no political title, and no military backing. To everyone in the room, he is a helpless man caught in the terrifying machinery of imperial justice. Festus rises from his seat to officially open the hearing. He turns to King Agrippa and the assembled elite, gesturing toward the prisoner. He explains that the Jewish multitude has petitioned him, shouting that Paul ought not to live any longer. But Festus publicly admits that he found no capital offense. Then, the efficient, pragmatic governor makes a remarkable confession. He states the exact reason for this grand assembly. "I have nothing definite to write to my lord about him." Festus declares, "Therefore I have brought him before you all, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that, after we have examined him, I may have something to write, for it seems to me unreasonable, in sending a prisoner, not to indicate the charges against him." It is a moment of profound historical irony. The representative of the greatest empire on earth is publicly admitting that his vast legal system cannot articulate a single valid charge against the gospel. He is simply a bureaucrat begging for help to fill out a form. Festus believes he is the one in control. He believes he has organized this spectacle to solve an irritating paperwork problem. But step back and look at the room through a theological lens. His problem is extreme administrative efficiency colliding with a theological reality he cannot comprehend. He wants his province organized. Festus did not arrange this meeting. God did. God used a Roman governor's strict adherence to administrative procedure to assemble the most powerful, unreachable men in the region into one room, lock the doors, and force them to listen to a Jewish tentmaker. When Paul finally speaks, he does not beg for his life. He does not offer a desperate legal defense. He recognizes exactly what God has done. He looks directly at the king, the governor, and the military commanders, and he preaches the resurrection of Jesus Christ. He preaches until Festus interrupts him, shouting that Paul is out of his mind. He preaches until King Agrippa nervously deflects, asking if Paul is trying to persuade him to become a Christian. Paul uses the chains on his wrists as a sermon illustration, praying that everyone in the room would become exactly like him except for the iron. The room has been completely inverted. The prisoner is the one issuing the invitation. The judges are the ones on trial. Finally, the spectacle reaches its limit. The king stands up. The governor stands up. Bernice and the prominent men follow. The hearing is abruptly over. They withdraw to discuss the matter in private, leaving the grand hall behind. The kings and governors retreat to their chambers. But the administrative problem remains. Festus is left alone with his blank scroll. He must finally draft the official document that will accompany Paul across the sea. What will the ledger say? He wants his dockets cleared. And he wants to close the file on this prisoner named Paul. In the private chambers of the Caesarean palace, King Agrippa delivers his final verdict to the Roman governor. He looks at Festus and states, "This man is doing nothing to deserve death or imprisonment." He then adds the most crucial legal summary of Paul's life. This man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. But the appeal had been spoken. The imperial machinery could not be reversed. To Caesar he must go. And so, Festus finally sits down at his heavy marble desk to write the Lettere Dimissoriae, the official letter to the Emperor Nero. We do not have the exact text of that scroll, but the Book of Acts makes its contents undeniable. Based on Agrippa's royal consultation and Festus's own findings, the official imperial document, accompanying Paul across the Mediterranean, effectively cleared him of all political charges. It stated that this prisoner was not an insurrectionist. He was not a threat to the state. He was simply a man caught in a confusing dispute over his own religion. Step back and look at the magnificent, hidden architecture of this entire legal journey. God did not bypass the Roman Empire to get Paul to Rome. He commanded it. He used the strict, unsympathetic efficiency of a secular bureaucrat to protect Paul from assassins in Jerusalem. So, Festus acts with characteristic speed. The Book of Acts records that exactly 3 days after arriving in his new coastal headquarters, he used the administrative confusion of a Roman courtroom to legally separate the Christian message from a violent political rebellion. And he used a procedural paperwork delay to force the most powerful leaders in the region to sit and listen to the gospel. Because of Porcius Festus, Paul does not enter the capital of the world as an undocumented rebel. He enters as a Roman citizen, with an official letter of clearance, legally protected by the very empire that will one day try to destroy him. This is exactly why Paul is able to spend the next 2 years in a rented house in Rome, receiving visitors and preaching the kingdom of God, as the final verse of Acts describes, without hindrance. The legal shield forged on a bureaucrat's desk allowed the gospel to permanently take root in the heart of the ancient world. The camera of history returns to the coastal palace one last time. The bema seat stands empty. The chaotic mountain of scrolls left by Felix is finally gone. The desk is clean for the Roman governor. The symbol of the empty desk simply means a job well done. But for the believer, that empty desk represents something far deeper. It is a testament to the absolute sovereignty of God over the machinery of men. Festus packs his bags and travels up the mountain to Jerusalem. He wants to introduce himself to the high priest and the Jewish elite. This is where the historical record becomes intensely personal. When you are caught in the agonizing waiting rooms of life, it is easy to despair. When you are trapped in unfair corporate or legal systems, when your progress is held back by endless bureaucratic delays, or when your future seems to rest in the hands of people who completely misunderstand you, the system can feel like a prison. You may feel as though you are at the mercy of a cold and unfeeling world. But this narrative reveals a radically different reality. This is not ultimately a story about a prisoner trapped in a legal system. It is a story about a legal system being used to transport a divine message. You do not need the systems of this world to be fair, and you do not need human authorities to understand you. God is entirely capable of using a rigid, secular bureaucracy to protect you, position you, and propel you exactly where he intends you to be. Porcius Festus signed the scroll, sealed it with wax, and handed it to a centurion. He successfully cleared his docket, never realizing he was merely a courier for a divine decree. If this study helped you see the sovereignty of God in the overlooked details of Scripture, but the new Roman governor is not looking at the water. He is staring at a mountain of unread scrolls and neglected legal ledgers. He wants to establish authority and show them that a new, highly effective administration has arrived. Please subscribe and share this video with someone who is currently trapped in a season of waiting. Thank you for watching. He expects a formal, diplomatic greeting. He has no idea that he is stepping directly into an assassination plot he knows nothing about. For 2 years, the coastal prison had kept the apostle safely out of sight. Because Paul had been out of the public eye for so long, Festus likely expects this old, inherited case to be a minor footnote in his new administration, a simple paperwork error, to be corrected. But the religious leaders in Jerusalem have not forgotten the man in Caesarea. The meeting in Jerusalem begins with the careful, calculated politeness of ancient politics. The high priest and the chief men of the city stand before the newly appointed Roman governor. They welcome him. They acknowledge his authority. And then they ask for a favor. It sounds like a minor administrative request. They want a prisoner transferred. The man named Paul is currently being held down on the coast in Caesarea. Since the charges against him involve Jewish law and temple customs, it would make sense to try him in Jerusalem. They ask Festus to authorize the transfer and bring the prisoner up the mountain. It is a perfectly reasonable request to make to a new governor. It is the year AD 59, and Porcius Festus has just arrived in Judea to clean up a disaster, looking to build political goodwill. But it is a trap. The religious elite have no intention of holding a trial. They have arranged an ambush. The moment Paul's Roman guards lead him onto the winding, rocky road connecting Caesarea to Jerusalem, assassins will strike. The prisoner will be dead. The problem will be solved. And Festus will simply have to write off a casualty of local violence. This is the moment where a corrupt governor, like Felix, might have negotiated. A weak governor might have conceded just to keep the peace. But Porcius Festus is neither. He is a bureaucrat who operates strictly by the book. Without realizing it, Festus steps into the role of an unwitting protector. He looks at the religious leaders and delivers a textbook Roman response. He tells them that Paul is being kept at Caesarea, and that he himself is returning there shortly. If the Jewish leaders have charges to bring, the proper authorities must travel down to the coast and present them formally in a Roman court. Later, Festus would explain his reasoning to King Agrippa, stating proudly, "It is not the custom of the Romans to hand over anyone before they have faced their accusers and had an opportunity to defend themselves." He does not make this decision out of spiritual conviction. He does not care about Paul. He does not care about the message Paul carries. Festus protects the apostle purely because his administrative manual dictates that jurisdiction remains in his coastal headquarters. It is a stunning detail to notice. His predecessor, a man named Felix, was notoriously corrupt. Felix had treated the province like a personal bank account. God is using the cold, unfeeling machinery of Roman imperial procedure as a physical shield for the early church. For the viewer, the implication is profound. We often assume that God only works through miracles. willing hearts, or open doors. We panic when we are caught in the gears of secular systems, assuming that human bureaucracy is a barrier to God's will. But here, the rigid, unsympathetic rules of a pagan empire are the exact instruments God uses to keep the mission to Rome alive. Festus leaves Jerusalem after 8 or 10 days and travels back down to the sea. The next morning, he enters the praetorium. He ascends the steps to the bema, the raised judgment seat that represents the absolute, unyielding authority of the Roman Empire. The Jewish accusers who have traveled from Jerusalem stand before him. Paul is brought in chains. Festus is a man of efficiency. He expects a clear-cut case of sedition. He expects to hear evidence of tax evasion, political rebellion, or perhaps a violent uprising. He expects a problem that his rulebook can easily categorize and execute. But as the accusations begin to fly across the courtroom, Festus hears something that completely shatters his categories. When the trial finally begins, the efficient governor realizes his rulebook is entirely useless. The air in the Caesarean courtroom is thick with shouting. The Jewish leaders who have traveled from Jerusalem stand around Paul, hurling serious and heavy accusations, leaving behind riots, political chaos, unpaid bribes, and a backlog of forgotten prisoners. Deep inside that administrative mess is a 2-year-old file concerning a Jewish tentmaker named Paul. Porcius Festus sits above them on the bema seat, the marble platform of Roman justice. He listens closely, expecting the kind of evidence a governor can act upon. He expects them to produce hidden daggers. He expects witnesses to testify about unpaid taxes, or to uncover a planned riot against the emperor. Instead, he hears a theological argument. The accusers cannot prove a single political charge. The entire trial quickly devolves into an intense, localized dispute about temple purity, ancient Jewish laws, and most confusing of all, to the Roman governor, a dead man named Jesus, whom Paul insists is alive. We can almost see Festus staring blankly at his empty legal scroll. Later, when describing this bizarre trial to King Agrippa, Festus uses a very specific Greek word to summarize the entire event. He states that the accusers only had certain points of dispute with Paul about their own diacedaimonia. The translation is accurate, but the original term carries an additional sense. In our English Bibles, it is usually translated as religion or superstition to a first-century Roman official. However, diacedaimonia described the irrational, overly emotional religious fears of foreigners. Romans valued civic duty, philosophical order, and state-sanctioned gods. They viewed Eastern religious disputes as primitive, exhausting, and legally irrelevant. For Festus, this word explains his paralysis. He is not presiding over a treason trial. He is caught in the middle of a squabble about foreign superstition. When most readers encounter this moment in the book of Acts, they tend to blur the Roman authorities together. But the detail that frustrates him most is the resurrection. Festus later admits that the whole argument came down to a certain Jesus, who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. To the Christian reader, the resurrection is the explosive center of human history. It is the defeat of death and the inauguration of a new creation. But to the Roman administrative mind, the resurrection was not a spiritual threat. It was bureaucratic nonsense. Festus cannot execute a man for claiming a dead carpenter is alive. There is no Roman penal code against a theological debate. There is no section in his imperial manual that covers resurrection from the dead. The efficient governor is stuck. If Paul had been an insurrectionist, Festus would have crucified him before noon. If he had been a thief, Festus would have imprisoned him. But because Paul is preaching the gospel, Festus cannot figure out what to write in his official ledger. The ultimate standard of human administrative power, the bema seat, has just proven completely inadequate to judge spiritual truth. This leaves Festus in a dangerous position. He is a new governor who urgently needs to establish peace in a volatile province. He cannot afford to anger the powerful Jewish leadership. During his first month in office, But he also cannot legally condemn a Roman citizen on the basis of disidaimonia. Pontius Pilate, Felix, Festus. They are typically viewed as the exact same stock villain. We assume Festus is he must find a way to clear his desk without starting a riot. He decides to offer a compromise. It seems like a simple procedural shift, a way to clear his docket and appease his subjects at the same time. But for the prisoner standing before him, it is a deadly maneuver. Unable to rule on theology, Festus defaults to politics. And that is when the trap snaps shut. Festus sits on the bema seat, staring down at the prisoner. The legal arguments have stalled. The evidence is non-existent. But the political tension in the room is heavy. Festus needs an exit. The book of Acts records a chilling detail. Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, leans forward and offers a compromise. He asks Paul a simple procedural question. Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there on these charges? To the Roman governor. This is a brilliant bureaucratic maneuver. He is managing the ledger of his new province. By moving the trial to Jerusalem, he hands a massive political victory to the Jewish elite, securing their loyalty. But by insisting that the trial will still be held before me, he maintains Roman jurisdictional authority. It is a perfect administrative compromise. It clears his docket and buys him peace. But this is where the cold reality of human systems is exposed. Bureaucracy, even when functioning efficiently, will always sacrifice individual truth for systemic peace. Festus does not care whether Paul is innocent or guilty. Another hostile, greedy politician standing in the way of the early church. But the historical record reveals a striking contradiction. He only cares that the machinery of the province continues to run smoothly. But for Paul, the governor's compromise is a death sentence. The apostle knows exactly what awaits him on the rocky road to Jerusalem. The assassins are still hiding in the hills. If he agrees to this change of venue, he will never see the gates of the city. He will bleed to death in the dirt. Paul realizes in this moment that he can no longer rely on provincial justice. The system has failed. The bema seat, for all its marble grandeur, cannot protect him from political convenience. So, Paul changes the rules of engagement. He straightens his posture and addresses the governor not as a Jewish prisoner, but as a Roman citizen. I am standing before Caesar's tribunal. Paul declares where I ought to be tried. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you yourself know very well. Paul publicly calls out the governor's political game. He forces Festus to acknowledge the truth. There is no legal reason to move the trial. If Paul is guilty of a capital crime, he is ready to die. But if the charges are false, no man has the right to hand him over as a political favor. Then, the prisoner utters a phrase that instantly paralyzes the room. In the Greek text, it is two words, Caesara epikalomai. In Latin, the administrative language of the empire, it is Caesarem, appello. I appeal to Caesar. It is hard to overstate the explosive power of clause. Porcius Festus was not a corrupt tyrant. He did not delay justice to extort money. He was a strict, highly competent, by-the-book Roman bureaucrat. Those words, in a first-century Roman courtroom. The right of provocatio, the right to appeal directly to the emperor, was one of the oldest and most sacred privileges of a Roman citizen. It was an absolute legal firewall against the abuse of provincial magistrates. The moment those words leave Paul's mouth, the trial stops. Festus can no longer condemn him. Festus can no longer release him. Festus cannot even transfer him to Jerusalem. The jurisdiction of the trial has instantly vanished from the governor's hands. The governor had offered a change of venue. The prisoner demands a change of empire. The courtroom in Caesarea falls completely silent. The words, I appeal to Caesar, hang in the air, instantly shifting the balance of power in the room. In the ancient Roman legal system, the provocatio was a sacred mechanism. It was not a polite request. It was an absolute demand. If a Roman citizen felt a provincial magistrate was biased, corrupt, or preparing to surrender them to a hostile mob, they could invoke this right. immediately halting all local proceedings. The moment the appeal was spoken, the governor lost all jurisdiction. He could not judge. He could not punish, and he could not release. The prisoner was now the exclusive property of the emperor's court in Rome. Festus pauses. He turns his back to the crowded room and leans in to confer with his concilium, the private council of Roman legal advisors standing near the bema seat.